On January 16th, 2026, Mark Carney stood in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, shook hands with Xi Jinping, and called it a new era. He signed a strategic partnership. He unlocked nearly $3 billion in Canadian agricultural exports. He got China to slash its canola seed tariff from 84% down to 15%. He secured visa-free travel for Canadians to China. He walked out with 8 memoranda of understanding covering energy, forestry, pet food, culture, and tourism. And he flew home. 8 days later, Donald Trump exploded on Truth Social. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA. One problem: the deal was already done. And here is the part that should change how you read every headline about this conflict from here on out. Trump himself had been asked about it the day Carney left Beijing. Standing in the White House, the president said, "That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that." That was January 16th. 8 days later, on Truth Social, a 100% tariff threat, the word Governor Carney deployed as an insult, and a warning that China will eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. Same man, same deal, opposite reaction. What happened in between those 8 days is a story about economics, about geopolitical positioning, and about a very deliberate Canadian strategy that obtained everything it wanted while giving Trump almost nothing to grab onto. Over the next several minutes, you are going to see exactly how that happened, what it means for where North America is heading, and why the gap between Trump's fury and Carney's calm response is not accidental. It is the strategy itself. Let's start with what actually happened in Beijing, because the Western press largely missed the full scope of it. Carney arrived in China on January 13th, 2026. This was the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to Beijing since Justin Trudeau went in 2017. That 9-year gap was not random. Relations between Canada and China had been in a deep freeze. It started with the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver in 2018, followed by China's retaliatory detention of 2 Canadians known as the Two Michaels. Then came years of diplomatic hostility, accusations of election interference, and a tit-for-tat tariff war that erupted after Canada imposed 100% duties on Chinese electric vehicles in October 2024, mirroring what the Biden administration had done in the United States. China hit back hard. It slapped 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and peas, and 25% on pork and seafood, including lobster. For Canada's prairie farmers, who depend heavily on the Chinese canola market, that retaliation was devastating. China is a $4 billion canola seed market for Canada. With tariffs at 84%, it was effectively closed. Carney walked into Beijing with a list of problems and came out with most of them resolved. By March 1st, 2026, China agreed to lower its tariff on Canadian canola seed to approximately 15%. China removed tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas entirely for at least the rest of the year. Canada agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market annually at a tariff rate of 6.1%, growing to roughly 70,000 vehicles over 5 years. The 5-pillar strategic partnership Carney and Xi announced together covered energy cooperation, economic and trade ties, public safety, multilateralism, and cultural exchanges. Xi committed to visa-free travel for Canadians entering China. Both sides signed 8 separate memoranda of understanding, spanning clean technology, forestry products, and tourism. Carney called it enormous progress and a new era. Xi described it as a turnaround. The Canadian government's own press release said the results would help unlock nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian workers and businesses. That is what was signed. Now, here is what it was not. It was not a free trade agreement. And that distinction is not semantic hair-splitting. It is the load-bearing wall of Carney's entire response to Trump's threat. Under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known in Canada as CUSMA and in the US as USMCA, Canada has a specific obligation. It cannot pursue free trade agreements with non-market economies without giving prior notification to its North American partners. China is classified as a non-market economy. A full free trade deal with China would require Canada to formally notify the United States and Mexico before proceeding. Carney knew this. His government knew this. The Beijing Agreement was engineered specifically to deliver real economic gains without crossing the legal and political tripwire embedded in CUSMA. What was signed was a series of targeted tariff reductions on specific goods, combined with a strategic partnership framework, not a comprehensive free trade agreement, not even close. When Trump's Truth Social post came on January 24th, Carney was ready. He did not flinch. He did not hold an emergency press conference. He walked out and said, clearly and without apparent stress, "We have commitments under CUSMA not to pursue free trade agreements with non-market economies without prior notification. We have no intention of doing that with China or any other non-market economy. What we have done with China is to rectify some issues that developed in the last couple of years." That is it. That is the entire defense. And it worked because it was true. Fen Osler-Hampson, a professor of international affairs at Carleton University, said the Beijing deal simply restored the pre-tariff war status quo on select goods, like canola and EVs. That's not free trade, anything but. Even with the new terms, China still has a 15% tariff on Canadian canola, and Canada still has a 6% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles. These are not the conditions of a free trade agreement. They are the conditions of two countries agreeing to de-escalate a specific contained trade conflict. Dominic LeBlanc, Canada's minister responsible for Canada-US trade, reinforced the position on the same day. There is no pursuit of a free trade deal with China. What was achieved was resolution on several important tariff issues. But while all of this was unfolding, a larger story was playing out that explains why Carney went to Beijing in the first place. And that story starts with what Carney said at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, just days before Trump's Truth Social post landed. On January 20th, 2026, Carney gave what many political analysts are already calling one of the most significant speeches by any Western leader in recent memory. He stood at the Davos podium and, without naming Trump directly, delivered a clear-eyed diagnosis of the moment. "The old order is not coming back," he said. "We should not mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy." He described a world in which great powers are using economic integration as weapons. He warned that the rules-based international order is fading. He called for middle powers to cooperate because, as he put it, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. Trump was watching, and Trump did not like it. On January 21st at Davos, he shot back. "Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements." On January 22nd, Trump posted on Truth Social that he was withdrawing Canada's invitation to join his so-called Board of Peace, a body Trump had assembled to weigh in on global conflicts. On January 24th came the 100% tariff threat. The escalation was rapid, and the sequencing matters. Carney made two moves in close succession. He went to Beijing and signed a deal with China. Then he stood at Davos and told the world that middle powers cannot afford to be economically dependent on any single great power. Trump connected those two dots and reacted with maximum noise. But notice what Carney did in response to all of that noise. He kept the gains. He did not cancel the Beijing deal. He did not renegotiate the canola tariff structure. He did not issue an apology. He gave a legal explanation, cited a trade agreement that the United States itself had signed, and waited. And here is what the 100% tariff threat actually looks like when you put numbers around it. Canada exports approximately $500 billion worth of goods to the United States each year. The United States, Canada, and Mexico together account for one of the most integrated economic relationships on Earth. Canadian crude oil supplies a significant share of what American refineries process in the Midwest. Canadian aluminium provides roughly 2/3 of all primary aluminium consumed in the United States. Auto parts cross the border multiple times during the manufacturing process before a finished vehicle reaches a dealership. A Michigan State University supply chain professor responded to Trump's tariff threat by saying it would result in a significant inflationary spike in the United States. He added, "Do I think there is any chance POTUS goes through with this threat, especially for energy products? Absolutely no chance." The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared on ABC's This Week and said, "We can't let Canada become an opening that the Chinese pour their cheap goods into the US." But Bessent did not say how 49,000 Chinese EVs entering Canada annually, capped and subject to a 6.1% tariff, would accomplish that particular catastrophe. Under the terms of the deal, by 2030, half of those imported vehicles must cost less than $35,000, making them consumer market vehicles, not industrial components for cross-border arbitrage. None of this stopped the Truth Social posts. Trump added a follow-up that said, "China is successfully and completely taking over the once great country of Canada. So sad to see it happen. I only hope they leave ice hockey alone." That post landed while Chinese imports into Canada were still subject to meaningful tariffs. Canadian sovereignty was fully intact, and Carney was conducting a calm press conference in Ottawa. Now step back from the noise and look at the architecture of what Carney has actually built. Canada, under Carney, is pursuing a specific theory. The country sends roughly 70% of its merchandise exports to the United States. That number edged down from about 76% in 2024 to around 72% in 2025, as Canadian exporters began rerouting shipments to other markets in response to American tariff pressure. That is still a level of dependence that, as Carney has said publicly, leaves Canada structurally exposed to whatever Washington decides to do on any given morning. The Beijing deal is the first concrete step in a deliberate diversification strategy. China is Canada's second largest trading partner. Canadian exports to China were worth $30 billion in 2024. With the new tariff framework on canola, lobster, and other agricultural products, that number has significant room to grow. The Canadian government has set a goal of a 50% increase in Canadian exports to China by 2030. Carney had been laying the groundwork for months. He met Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea in October 2025. He described that meeting as a turnaround. He went to Beijing in January as a direct follow-on. He signed 8 memoranda of understanding on day one of the visit, covering energy cooperation, forestry products, and pet food. The big agricultural and EV tariff deal came on day 2. He was back in Canada within the week. The deal drew mixed reviews at home. Ontario's provincial government and the Canadian auto sector warned about the risks of giving Chinese manufacturers greater access to the Canadian vehicle market. Prairie premiers and farm groups celebrated the canola news. That domestic split is real, but the federal government's position has been consistent. In an era where the United States is using tariffs as leverage, Canada cannot afford to have only one major trading relationship. And this is where Carney's framing at Davos connects back to the Beijing deal in a way that is not coincidental. He was not just making a speech about world order. He was publicly announcing Canada's diplomatic posture. The Beijing deal and the Davos speech were parts of the same argument. Canada has energy resources, critical minerals, agricultural products, and a stable financial system. The world needs those things. The question is whether Canada will offer them to the world, or whether it will sit quietly while one trading partner uses tariff threats to constrain its options. Carney's answer has been clear. Canada will offer them to the world. Trump's response was to threaten to punish Canada for doing exactly what any rational trading nation would do in its position. And the most revealing detail in this entire episode is the one from January 16th, when a reporter at the White House asked Trump whether he was worried about Carney's growing relationship with China. Trump said, "Canada should go get the deal." Then 8 days later, after the Davos speech, after the Board of Peace drama, after Trump told the world, "Canada lives because of the United States," the same deal became grounds for a 100% tariff threat. The deal did not change. What changed was the political temperature between the two leaders. That is a problem that has nothing to do with trade law and everything to do with how fragile the Canada-US relationship has become under the current dynamic. Carney has staked out a position that Canada will respect its legal obligations under CUSMA, will not pursue a formal free trade agreement with China, and will simultaneously diversify its trade relationships wherever it legally can. He has drawn the line precisely where the treaty says the line is. Not an inch further, not an inch back. What Trump got from this entire episode was a truth social thread and a series of posts that became less coherent as the weekend went on. What Carney got was lower canola tariffs, duty-free seafood access to 1.4 billion consumers, a framework for energy cooperation, and a visa-free travel commitment from Beijing. And he kept all of it. The deeper issue here is not whether Canada is becoming a Chinese ally or whether Trump's tariff threat was credible. The deeper issue is that the rules-based framework that governed North American trade relations, the very agreement Trump's first administration signed and which bears his name, contains provisions that protect Canada's right to do exactly what Carney did in Beijing. Canada invoked those provisions. Canada kept the deal. Canada absorbed the noise. That sequence is going to repeat. Carney has already said he expects to return to China for the APEC Leader Summit later this year. The five-pillar strategic partnership is a long-term architecture, not a one-time transaction. Energy cooperation is specifically mentioned. Canada's LNG export potential is significant. China is one of the world's largest energy consumers. The conversations that started in Beijing are not finished. Meanwhile, the question of whether a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods would ever actually happen carries its own built-in answer. Canada supplies the crude oil that heats American homes in the Midwest. Canada supplies the aluminium that goes into American fighter jets and consumer electronics. Canada is woven into American supply chains so tightly that the cost of a real tariff at that level would fall directly on American consumers and American manufacturers. The professor from Michigan State was not wrong. None of that means the threat is harmless. Uncertainty itself is damaging. Canadian businesses have been absorbing planning disruptions, investment pauses, and currency volatility throughout 2025 and into 2026. Economists estimate the tariff cycle of 2025 and 2026 has already reduced Canadian GDP by between 1.5% and 2%. That is real damage, paid by real people. But Carney's argument, the one he has been making consistently since Davos, is that the alternative to diversification is permanent vulnerability. If Canada responds to every tariff threat by abandoning its other trade relationships, it will be entirely dependent on Washington's mood. And Washington's mood, at this particular moment in history, is not a stable foundation for a national economic strategy. If you are not at the table, you are on the menu, he said it in Davos. He meant it in Beijing. And he said it clearly enough that Trump heard it, understood it, and answered with a 100% tariff threat that came 8 days after he had told reporters the deal was a good idea. The deal is done. The canola tariffs are coming down. The lobster is moving. The EVs are capped and monitored. Canada kept every gain it walked out of Beijing with, and Mark Carney has not raised his voice once. That gap, between the noise coming from Washington and the quiet accumulation of results coming from Ottawa is not a diplomatic accident. It is a strategy, and it is working. If you want to follow what actually happens next in North American trade, and not just what gets posted on Truth Social, subscribe and share this with someone who is paying attention. The next chapter is already being written.